Connor, I went ahead and pressed record, so we're ready when you are.
We're good to go? Perfect. All right. Well, to start off, yes, my name is Conor Barnes. I'm a PhD student under Direct Twidwell at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. My particular area of research involves ecology and law and how we can integrate ecological resilience, other ecology concepts into our legal framework. How can we make these things work for our policy? How can we improve our land management using these kind of sciencey, resilience-related concepts? So you saw the big fancy title, but just what the heck is a rigidity trap anyway? Why should I care about that? So rigidity trap is a phenomenon in social ecological systems where a system becomes very rigid. System resources are very tightly bound up. So a social ecological system is something that you all may very well be familiar with. It represents the integration between human activity and the environment. So we all know that ecosystems and human institutions, society, they don't exist as separate entities. They're very integrated into each other, and one will affect the other. And so the concept behind all of this is that the human institutions and the ecological systems have so tightly integrated their resources into each other that there's really only one particular path that they're constantly traversing. So they're very resilient. Did a nice job summarizing it, where there's a great capacity by like a human institution, for example, to focus on a very singular approach, so an outcome or a policy, and there's very low capacity to explore any alternatives to that. So think of it as almost like social ecological tunnel vision, if you would. So we do see rigidity traps on the Great Plains. For example, the Great Plains are experiencing a very rapid transformation from grassland to woodland due to woody plant invasion. That's not big news to anybody here. We've been talking all week at various points about this issue. And the past 10 years, and really even beyond that, have seen a growing awareness of the problem and attempts to find solutions. We've seen proposals through mechanical removal. We've seen an increasing use of prescribed burns and the development of grassroots-driven prescribed burn associations. And we've seen various methods of grazing as solutions to, for example, eastern red cedar invasion. And all of these have been done to varying degrees of success. Some have proved more successful than others, and all of them have had various challenges associated with them. And despite all of this, attempts at innovation, attempts at creativity, for the most part, we're still by and large managing the Great Plains for a set of policy goals that were established around the turn of the 20th century. And those policy goals involved getting trees on the landscape, suppressing prairie fires, and essentially making the Great Plains, or what it was termed at the time, the Great American Desert, look much more like the East Coast or Europe, where it's very heavily forest dominant. There's a lot of agriculture and pastoralism. Essentially, the Euro-American settlers wanted to change the landscape to reflect what they were used to back on the East Coast or back in Europe. For example, think about Arbor Day, as it didn't just materialize out of nowhere, right? It originated here in Nebraska precisely because they wanted to promote a tree planting culture and turn the Great Plains into a forest. Digging through some old papers by scientists and politicians and, excuse me, technical reports at the time, I found a pretty nice quote that summed this up pretty well. Now, if we can demonstrate that the pine tree can be grown on these sand hills without cultivation, would it not make the sand belt of Nebraska valuable for timber growing land? And is it not a fact that in the near future we will have to grow our own timber? And is it not another fact that if we can succeed in growing these sandy lands to this kind of timber, that we would have the prettiest and best country in the world? And would it not increase the rainfall and decrease the strong, dry south winds that are such a detriment to our country? And this is pretty reflective of the current ideas at the time of what was desirable for the Great Plains landscape, and as well as the associated beliefs for how the climate of the region worked. So I'm going to work a little outside the box here today. We're going to have a little quiz for anyone who's interested in participating. We're going to use Kahoot, which some of you may be familiar with, some of you may not. It is an online quiz platform. And our time is fairly limited, so anyone who's interested in participating is welcome to participate. You can either use the QR code or go to kahoot.it. And I'm going to pull up the Kahoot quiz passcode. I'm going to put it in the chat for anyone if they want to copy and paste it, or if they are just interested in holding on. Oops, except I send that to everybody. Great, we've got people coming in. Perfect. The system is unfortunately only set up to handle 50 people, so first 50 people get in, I suppose. Now I'll give it a few more seconds. I know we're on the clock. Okay, so we're going to give a quick start here. So there's no right or wrong answers. This one is just a poll. Who's ever heard of the phrase, "the rain follows the plow"? Simple yes or no will suffice. And I will explain just what that means in a moment. So quite a few people have heard about it. Awesome. And a few that haven't. Okay. So as a follow-up question then, who has heard of the phrase, "the rain follows the trees"? No. Wow. Very interesting how that's flipped. Okay. So a third question I have then. Who's heard of ecological succession theory in any of its various iterations? Even just the phrase ecological succession. Yeah, the answers are coming in pretty fast. I suspect I know the answer to this one. Yes, absolutely. Overwhelming majority have heard about ecological succession. I like the person who put in the maybe a long time ago. Okay, one last question for this round. Where did you hear about ecological succession? So did you hear about it through formal education? For example, when you were at school, either high school, university, perhaps you heard about it in the course of your work, you know, some kind of agency work, NGO, any of that. Perhaps you heard about it through a government or a non-governmental organization. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, we're going to come back and finish this quiz in just a moment, so hang on to that. But first, we're going to address a couple of these topics. Oh, I didn't mean for that to reset. So the rain follows the plow, the rain follows the trees, ecological succession. These are all early ecosystem theories. The rain follows the plow and the rain follows the trees in particular were popular among just lay people, not necessarily scientists. Politicians were latched onto the idea. And this is the idea that human agriculture activity leads to increased moisture, which leads to greater rainfall and more trees. We saw in the same Bussey paper, excuse me, that I cited Judge Tolliver from, one idea prevailed, that the advent of settlers would bring rain, and that the coming increase in rainfall would ensure the growth of trees. And the rain follows the trees, similar idea to the first. Trees would trap the moisture and wind and soil that would otherwise escape, would be released through transpiration. It would boost moisture content. You would have, in the end, increased rainfall. And by their own admission, excuse me, the scientists at the time admitted that the various meteorological stations around Nebraska and the Great Plains didn't register any sort of an increase in moisture. And they were a little puzzled as to why that might be. Not that they didn't necessarily consider the theory was wrong, but rather that there was something holding back the system. And this is where succession theory comes into play. There's different flavors of succession theory, but Frederick Clement's version is the most widely known. So just out of curiosity for anybody out there. Uh-oh. In a Kahoot, there we go. Just out of curiosity, has anybody heard of Charles Bessey or Frederick Clements? I'm willing to bet a significant number of you have. Pretty mixed. Yes, by and large, a lot of people have heard of Bessey, and a large number have heard of, excuse me, Clements. So of course, if you've worked in Nebraska for any length of time, especially the natural resources sector, you've probably heard of Charles Bessey. He was a botanist at the University of Nebraska and very famous for a lot of his theories relating to sandhills, forestry in the sandhills, and a wide number of botany subjects besides. Now, Frederick Clements was a student of Charles Bessey at the university, and he's the one who developed the most popular version of succession theory. And a few of the highlights of his particular version of theory involved the idea that ecosystem development occurs in one direction, and that there's an end state that all ecosystems inevitably move toward. So you start with pioneer plants, some disturbance has occurred, a bunch of weedy, hardy plants will move in, and then that'll follow in grasses and shrubs. Then you progress to small trees and savanna, and then finally an old growth forest. And then but for disturbances such as fires, human activity, you would reach that end state. And so the theory that Bessey and a number of his contemporaries held was that the Great Plains, all these prairies, are being perpetually disturbed by fire and human activity, and that's why you don't see any forests on the Great Plains. And so all we had to do was suppress fires, plant a bunch of trees, and basically skip from this grassland state to a forest state. So the land management paradigm that was established at the time reflected this. These early ecosystem theories geared policies toward agriculture, afforestation, including fire suppression, targeted grazing, planting windbreaks all over the place, installing tree nurseries, with the general idea of anchoring in that moisture and creating economically viable timber industry in Nebraska. And Bessey even mentions, one of the key things we need to do is stop prairie fires, establish a bunch of nurseries, and that sort of a thing. So just to revisit rigidity traps real quick, recall that they occur when a system becomes very rigid and system resources are very tightly bound up. There's little innovation. Agencies and other institutions, the culture in general is hyper-focused on a single issue or approach and unable to look at alternatives. And that's what we see here at the Great Plains. We're still stuck in this management paradigm where we are implementing all of these things that were valued at the beginning of the 20th century, but we don't necessarily see the same values reflected today. So how do we break out of rigidity traps? There's not a lot of suggestions in the economic literature, or academic literature. So one aspect that we is property law. One discipline specifically is common law, which is judge-made law as opposed to legislative law that's made by Congress, for example. Judge-made law is made by judges over the course of time. So in this case, it can be centuries. So they have judicial decisions going back to 1600s in Lincoln, that'd be impressive, in England, which still are valid law today. Traditional common law categories always deal with private persons and private actions. So think about contracts, person-to-person agreements, torts, person-to-person injuries, and property, which is the transfer of property from one person to another. And judges ran into a problem with how people inherited land. When people write wills, when they want to convey land to another person, they can make sure it comes with strings attached. This very very fancy deed here to the right kind of reflects some of that very official writing. But lawyers have to look for language in a will such as so long as, but if, there's some kind of timing or durational element. And this can impose on the new landowners an obligation to manage land in a certain way indefinitely. So for example, I might convey land for school purposes, right? Well, if I convey a person to the school board this land for school, so long as it is used for school purposes, if they stop using it for school purposes, that land reverts back to me. So this can force land managers and the new landowners to operate under a specific pathway that may not reflect changing circumstances. And as a rule, the law doesn't really like this sort of conveyance. Society would much prefer to have land as clear title, to be freely bought and sold. But we have to balance that with individual desires, a desire to leave a legacy. So the solution has been to restrict situations where these clauses are valid. If the clause is void, if it isn't done properly, if it's too vague, it doesn't void the conveyance itself, importantly, but it instead voids the strings attached. This is called the rule against perpetuities, and under its umbrella, we have the dead hand principle. The dead hand principle specifically is all about keeping management and control in the present, as opposed to being guided by the whims of people who have passed away, possibly for a very long time. We want to manage our land for the present and future, not according to the values and desires of people who passed away a long time ago. This is the sort of approach, the very sort of principle that we need to implement on our large-scale land management culture in Nebraska and in the Great Plains. We've made a lot of progress, not just in the past 10 years and really in the past couple of decades, to shift land management to reflect present needs instead of past values. We've seen this discussion repeatedly come in and out as we've kind of discussed this theme of 10 years Nebraska natural legacy. But our land management culture is still guided by the priorities of people who set up the current managed system, and it's sort of run deeply ingrained in the culture, even though they passed away a long time ago, and a lot of the concerns they had at the time were no longer reflective of the concerns of the present. So the dead hand provides a guiding principle to manage for present needs. We can use it to identify where our policies, our actions, resource management, all these things, we can use them to reflect on what is guiding our values and strategies, and whether they predate modern ecology and our modern thinking. We need to use the dead hand principle to overcome our land management rigidity trap and address the changing landscape. Opportunities to reflect on why our policies are the way they are, and then furthermore, change our policies to provide those alternative pathways I mentioned in our rigidity trap discussion, and promote innovation. So as a concrete example, we have Nebraska fire policy. We need to change our state policy to empower landowners to experiment and innovate. Kyle was just talking with the last presentation about protect the core, grow the core, and these landowners who are burning large tracts of property. How can we foster that sort of innovation through state policy in order to promote these new ways of thinking and addressing a serious economic issue? Because our state's economic concerns and environmental values have changed since the turn of the 20th century. There's less of concern and reliance on local timber to fuel our economy. Grasslands are very critical for grazing. We're concerned about species habitat. You know, the list of ecosystem services provided by grasslands goes on. And so the economic consequences of our rigidity trap are rising. So let's promote flexibility and innovation in our land management policies to address them. And how am I doing on time here?
You're looking at about 8 minutes until the hour. So
Perfect. How do I? Here we go. So since we have a little extra time, when I tested this with my focus group, we had some time issues. I'm going to have one last. Uh-oh. No, maybe not. Technical glitch. To reinforce my point about the rigidity, excuse me, to reinforce my point about the the dead hand principle and changing some of the legal language and just how important that sort of a thing is, we'll have a little law school exam. So if anyone has their Kahoot still booted up, here's a question for you. So if an owner conveys a piece of property to the school board, so long as the land is used for school purposes, is that legally valid or invalid? Hint, hint, I did give the answer during the presentation. Yes, correct. You're absolutely correct. So in this situation, I have to use this land for school purposes. I can't sell the land. Maybe I need a new school somewhere else. I'm stuck using this land for school purposes because if I don't, I have to give it back to the original owner. All right, last question. Oh. So the owner conveys the property to the school board, but if the property ceases to be used for school purposes, then it goes to Adam and his heirs. So is this legally valid? Eleven yes, 7 no. The 7 who've got it are right. It is not legally valid. And as my focus group mentioned earlier, their response was, what? Why? What's the difference? And the key language here is the but if. So if I have a duration that is, so long as, then I'm okay because that particular element is in place and satisfies the rules of perpetuities, which is very complicated and I'm not going to get into here. But if I have a requirement where the people who end up inheriting the property are unknown or indefinite, then I can go ahead and strike the provision. So what's important here is that this O to school board is not struck out, but instead it stays there as it's legally valid. So I strike the void provision and leave the owner to the school board provision. So what would end up happening is the original owner would convey the property to the school board and the school board would get the title free and clear. Remember, the law doesn't like these sort of strings attached, right? So any opportunity that the judge has to just give the title free and clear to the other owner or the new owner, that is the preferred outcome. We want to promote flexibility and we want to promote the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Okay, with that, I've got about 5 minutes left on the clock. So any questions? I'm happy to take them.